This is Washington Watch. I'm Tony Perkins, your host. So good to have you with us. The website is tonyperkins.com. And be sure and check out the new site, that is Washington Stand, where you can find biblical commentary and news. News and commentary from a biblical perspective. In fact, my next guest has an op-ed placed on there, and he is talking about what is our first priority, our first freedom. And we're going to talk about that in the context of what's happening right now on Capitol Hill. The House is moving right now, even as we vote, on gun control legislation. The president last week, after the shooting in Texas, went before the nation, and this is what he said.
It's time for each of us to do our part. It's time to act for the children we've lost, for the children we can save, for the nation we love. Let's hear the call and the cry. Let's meet the moment. Let us finally do something.
Yes, I agree. We must do something. But we must do something that actually does something. And what is that something? Well, that's the question for my next guest, Dr. Ben Carson, former Secretary of Housing and Urban Development and presidential candidate. He is now the chairman of the American Cornerstone Institute. Dr. Carson, welcome back to Washington Watch.
Thank you. Always good to be with you.
Dr. Carson, let me ask you this question. We're hearing a lot. It's tragic. I mean, I can't imagine there's a parent in America that is not touched by what happened in Uvalde, Texas. Yes, we need to do something, but should we not do something that actually accomplishes what we want, making our children safer?
Well, see, that would involve logic and common sense as opposed to emotion. And so often we just react emotionally. The question that we should be asking about the various proposals that are being put forth is, would this have stopped that incident from occurring? And, you know, the previous incident and the incident before that, would this have stopped it? If the answer is no, then let's move to the next solution. But let's look for solutions that actually accomplish something. And we don't want to lose in this discussion the actual reason for the Second Amendment. Second Amendment is not about deer hunting. The Second Amendment is about people having the means to protect themselves, you know, from criminal elements and from an overly aggressive government. You can't do that with a pea shooter. So if you look at countries like Cambodia, China, Venezuela, so many others who became dictatorships, they always take the guns away first. Why is that? And they always seem to have a good reason for taking the guns away, make the citizens defenseless, and then be able to control them. And that's the very reason that our founders put that in there. So we need to be cognizant of that. And we need to be looking for real solutions that will stop this. The school in Texas, what would have stopped it? Certainly if the school had been hardened, they only had one way in, that was a guarded way. I don't think that would have happened. Those are the kinds of things that we should be talking about.
When we look at who these shooters are, these are young men who are, in many cases, they're isolated, they're under stress, they're in crisis. In fact, the most recent study I've seen of a couple of decades worth of these shootings, 82% of these young men came from broken or dysfunctional homes. I mean, that's correct. Why are we not having a conversation about that?
Because that would be getting to the heart of the matter. And we like to just deal around the periphery and deal with the symptoms. But there's no question, we've moved away from our faith and we've moved away from our families. And if you look at some of the writings of some of the Marxists several decades ago, when they were talking about how to bring down the United States, they said, we have very strong family structure and a very strong faith. And if you can interrupt those things, the United States would fall quite rapidly. I think they're right, but I don't think it's too late to correct that. But, you know, when you look at a place that has even more guns per capita than the United States, Switzerland, and yet their gun homicide value is very, very low because they teach people how to use the weapon when they turn of age to receive a weapon, and virtually everyone there has a weapon. So that's what we should be looking at. If we disarm the good citizens, then we just leave the bad citizens, the criminals, to run rampant and with nobody to stop.
Because they're certainly not going to obey the law.
No, they don't care.
But the Second Amendment, I think, is at risk because it's been misused by some, because we've neglected, I think, our First Amendment, and that is freedom, and our first freedom. And you actually have a piece that is up at Washington Stand talking about the importance of this first freedom, our freedom of religion.
Right, because our religion really gives us our belief system. Who are we? What are our values? And when we don't have values, what begins to happen? When we lose our respect for life, for instance, from the womb to the tomb, then we don't care not only about the babies in the womb, but we don't care about those drug addicts on the street and all the people who are languishing out there. And we become callous in our attitude toward each other. And when that callousness occurs, particularly among these young shooters, they really don't think about the other person. They don't think about their lives. They don't think about their families. They just think about the hatred that is harbored in their heart. And if you don't have the love of God, something else is going to replace the emptiness.
Well, and that is what some of the studies show, is that one of the elements, there's like 5 elements that are common among so many of these shooters, is a loss of moral sense of right and wrong. But when we've kicked God, we've expelled him out of our schools, we no longer have prayer, we don't have the 10 Commandments, we certainly don't have the Bible. It has allowed evil to move to the head of the class. I mean, it is what is dictating what's happening in our schools. So it frustrates me, Dr. Carson, that we can't figure this out. It's so easy to connect the dots. We've removed morality and religion, and now evil, death, and destruction has come in.
Because many just don't want to acknowledge that there is such a thing as evil, and that there is an evil force. And therefore they have to invent other things. And it's sad. You know, the Bible tells us, you know, that the human heart is desperately wicked. You know, who can know it? We have to have the love of God that comes in and permeates us and gives us the ability to love our fellow man. And that's one of the real Christian values. Love your neighbor as yourself. Not hate your neighbor, not cancel your neighbor, but love your neighbor. And when we throw that out, those other things come in. And that's why we're seeing so much hatred, bitterness, intolerance. I mean, this is almost like a different country than it used to be.
Yeah.
When
and
I
it's
was a
happened
kid.
very rapidly. It's happened very rapidly.
It has. And we have people who are driving wedges between people on the basis of race, religion, income, age, political affiliation, you name it, they're driving wedges.
So we've diagnosed the situation. It's pretty bad. The hour is late. And you said we can turn it around, and I agree with you. I think we can turn it around, but it's going to require intentionality on behalf of, I believe, people that are people of faith, that know the Lord Jesus Christ and are willing to stand up for truth. So what do we need to be doing? What do our viewers, our listeners, those that have a relationship with the Lord Jesus Christ and understand the morality and those principles you talked about, what do we need to be doing right now?
Well, first of all, we need to understand that God is in control. But we also need to understand that we all have a sphere of influence. And we can affect what's going on in that sphere of influence by the way we behave ourselves and the way that we treat other people. That is so essential. And it does require courage. And we also, in this country, have something that's very special. We have a democratic republic, which means we elect people to represent us. And it's so important to make sure that the values of the people that you vote for line up with your values. And a lot of people won't do that. They just go into the voting booth and they look for the name that looks familiar. Oh, yeah, I know that name. And that's the one they check.
Right.
Well, that is a very awful way to vote. And if we begin to vote our values, we begin to see some real changes occur.
Yeah, a great point, because that is name ID. That's why they spend so much money on TV, just putting their name up over and over. But folks, as I've talked about before, we have resources available for you to help you when you go into the voting booth, whether it's the primary election or the general. Go to frcaction.org, voter resources. I know Dr. Carson is involved in these efforts as well. I like what you said, because I think it is the thing, from my perspective, that is missing. That is courage. That's why people shrink back in silence because of a negative social media post or some, and I really think that's the intention of the media and the others by mocking people of faith. It's to take away our courage, discourage us.
To discourage us from talking about our faith, from acting our faith out. And, this whole thing about white guilt, which is being used, the race issue, as a cudgel to beat people into submission and make them feel guilty. Well, if they feel guilty, what do? They stand in a corner with their head down. They don't shout to the heavens when you defund the police, when you let dangerous criminals out to terrorize neighborhoods, when you don't guard your southern borders, when you do a whole host of things. They just stand silently by. And that's got to change.
Yeah. We need to have courage, the courage to speak up in the face of opposition. And I love what you had to say, because it's each of us have a sphere of influence. It might just be in our home, but as parents, we have influence. And studies show this. Actually, our kids do listen to us if we'll speak to them and we'll walk out what we tell them, and that there's consistency in what we say and what we do. But parents, look, you know this, Dr. Carson, because you're putting together resources for parents. In fact, I'd like you just to tell our viewers and listeners about some of the resources that you are helping counter this narrative that America is a bad country, and you're putting this into the hands of parents. Tell us about it.
With American Cornerstone Institute, we have a segment called Little Patriots. And you can go to littlepatriotslearning.com and see the lessons that we have, K through 5, that teach the children the fundamentals of the values that made America into a great nation. And it gives you our true history, warts and all. We don't try to hide anything, but put it in perspective. It helps people understand our Constitution and our Bill of Rights and our Declaration of Independence, and the fact that our rights come from God. And those are the things that helped us to go from 0 to 60 miles an hour as a nation so quickly. We rose to the pinnacle of the world in record time because of the values that we had. It was not a coincidence by any stretch of the imagination. And as we throw those values away, we will decline as well.
And our education system they're not teaching those values, not teaching that history of our country. And we need to know it. So that gives us actually the courage to stand up and defend this country. So that knowledge is important. The courage then comes, and we need to speak out. And we need to, and I'm not saying speak out in terms of yelling and screaming, but engage in conversations, whether it's in the workplace, whether it's in the neighborhood or the church. We cannot afford to be silent any longer.
Absolutely. And let me just mention that the littlepatriotslearning.com is free of charge. We've gone through great lengths to make sure that we get enough underwriters to underwrite the program so that it be accessible to anybody. Homeschools, private schools, public schools, all schools. And homeschooling, by the way, has doubled since 2020. Yep. And it is a tremendous place to use a product like this.
Well, Dr. Ben Carson, it's always great to see you and talk with you. So grateful for the work that you do. You're a true American patriot, and glad that I can call you a friend.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, and right back at you.
All right. Dr. Ben Carson.